So my name's John Sledge. I work with the Historic Development Commission, and I want to talk a little bit about Mobile and Havana and our historic relationship, which I knew a little bit about, of course, but I have some friends who wanted to do a book about it and really explore it in more depth, and I said, I just don't think there's enough material for a book on that, and they reassured me that there was, and I really found out how wrong I was. So it's been fun. These are some of the characters in our project. Some of you may recognize Gray Reddit at top right. He's a past president of the Society Mobile La Havana. And we've been a sister city with Havana since 1993. And that was really a passion of Jay Higginbotham. Some of you may recall he was the city's municipal archivist, a remarkable guy. And I think he probably first went to Havana in the late 60s or early 70s when he was working on his book about Old Mobile. And then to his left is Julio Larramendi, who's a prominent Cuban photographer, and he has a publishing house in Guatemala called Ediciones Palomita, which is going to publish the book. And then on the left is Chip Cooper at a little bistro we were at in Havana. And Chip is an American photographer. Some of you might recognize his name from Alabama Heritage Magazine, and he's done books, did an exhibit at the History Museum some years ago. And then the woman at bottom is named Alicia Garcia Santana, and she's a prominent Cuban architectural historian who's got a lot of books and has a real passion for the built environment. And so they all know Mobile and Havana, and it's just been a real pleasure. So Gray's been really facilitating the project, and Julio and Chip and Alicia and I are doing the book as a shared effort between our two cities, a Cuban historian photographer and an American pair. And so here's where we are, of course, the Gulf of Mexico, 10th largest body of water in the world. And you can see Havana is really not that far away. It's only 540 nautical miles. So in the days of sail, if you had the right kind of wind, if you were going north to south and you had a norther behind you, you could do it pretty quickly. Or if you get a good southeast breeze coming up, you could make it back in good time. And of course, when steam technology came along, those vessels could do it in 2 or 3 days at the most. So it's natural that there should be communication between the two. And these are just some images of some of the things that we share in common as modern cities and really have throughout our history. One is the fantastic beaches. Here we see a view of Orange Beach down in Baldwin County, and then Veradero on the right, which is a popular resort to the east of Havana, where a lot of tourists like to go. And then, of course, a not-so-savory aspect of our shared environment are hurricanes, tropical storms. Havana's extremely exposed to them there. You can see on the left the results of, I think that's Katrina on Water Street, never a more appropriately named thoroughfare. And then to the right, we see what's called the Malecon, which is the seafront drive there that is on the Florida Straits. And you just get these tremendous booming waves that come in, and they can actually come in and flood the city to some degree, which creates a lot of hardship. So the shared history really goes back to the very beginning of both cities. This is a map by a Spanish sailor captain named Alonso de Pineda. And he was commissioned in 1519, 18 to discover how extensive La Florida was. Florida had been discovered, Ponce de Leon. They knew that it was large, but they thought it was an island. And of course, what they were looking for, besides silver and gold and souls to save and then kill, they were looking for a Northwest Passage, some kind of shortcut to the Pacific that could give them a fast track to the Orient, because that was the whole Columbus, rationale for the voyage in the first place to the Indies and the New World. They were really trying to get to the spices and the riches of China and India and the East for trade purposes. So Pineda comes in from Jamaica and comes up to the northern Gulf Coast, discovers Mobile Bay, the Mississippi River, which he called the Rio del Espiritu Santo, and all sailed along the littoral in both directions, really all the way down to the Keys and then back up into northern Mexico, and really discovered that La Florida was this immense landmass, essentially a continent. So this is one of the first maps we have that shows our shared parts of the world, and you can see it's not super accurate, but you can tell where everything roughly is. And of course, then the Spanish would dominate the Gulf of Mexico, or what was essentially a Spanish Sea, for 2 or 3 centuries after that. And one of the seminal figures was Hernando de Soto, Spanish Hidalgo, who became very rich in the conquest of the Inca in Peru and invested those funds in the conquest of La Florida because he thought that he would find equal kingdoms like Cortez had found in Mexico and like he had fought with Pizarro to conquer in Peru. And so the vessel that you see is a modern reproduction of a caravel or a caravela, which was really the technological reason the Spanish were able to conquer the Atlantic, get into the Indies, and maneuver among all these islands and coves and bays. It's an extremely seaworthy vessel. It's not very large, but very capable. And here you see what's called a lateen rig, but when they would cross the Atlantic, they'd do a square rig to take advantage of the trade winds, and they'd just set their sails and ride the trades for weeks to come across. And then when they got into the Gulf or the Indies, they could use the lateen rig to maneuver into bays and rivers and shallow water. They only drew 6 or 7 feet. So these are probably the kind of vessels that Pineda had. And he could have easily come into Mobile Bay, come all the way up to the rivers with a vessel like that. And then the bottom, of course, is the consequence of the entrada, as it was called, Soto's conquest. He has this army of several hundred men, several hundred horses, several hundred pigs. Thank you. They're the ancestors of the wild pigs that are now destroying the American South. So he lands at Tampa Bay and then comes on up into Georgia, the Carolinas, into a little bit of East Tennessee, and down through the Coosa River Valley into what's now Alabama, and all the way down to a place called Mobile, which is, of course, the original name of Mobile, named for the Mobile Indians, who, of course, were led by the fearsome Chief Tuscaloosa, who was 10 feet tall, according to the Spaniards, undoubtedly well-fed, and he told them that they were a bunch of vagabonds as far as he was concerned, and they had no business here. And so Soto promptly took him hostage and said, I'll let you go at the next town if you provide bearers and women for my soldiers. And, it's sort of like if you ever saw that movie, The Wild One, with Marlon Brando. It'd be kind of like Marlon Brando comes into your town along with Mick Jagger and Axl Rose on Harleys. Think of a town like Bay Minette or Citronelle, and they come roaring into the square, very intimidating, and you realize that if you got any teenage girls, you better lock them up, and that your world as you knew it was no longer going to be the same. That's essentially what happened here. So Tuscaloosa told Soto, I'll give you everything you need at Mobile. It's, principal city of my chiefdom. So they go there, and the Indians set a great trap. There's a great battle, one of the largest between Europeans and Native Americans ever on the North American continent. Something like 20 Spaniards were killed. They lost a lot of their horses, all their baggage. The only treasure they had found to that point was some river pearls, which were lost in the fire. And here you can see an artist's conception. Mobile was a walled town. The walls were built of interwoven branches that had mud slathered over them and smoothed, so they looked almost like stone, with these guard towers set at periodic distances. And then, of course, the Spaniards these guys were professional killers, so they also had horses and gunpowder, which were great advantages. They eventually got the upper hand and slaughtered, unfortunately, a great many Indians and really broke the Mobilians' power. But, of course, it broke Soto's expedition as well. Everybody was wounded. There were 700 arrow wounds total among his several hundred men, and they spent about a month there just recuperating. And then his soldiers wanted to come back to Mobile Bay or Pensacola Bay. They'd had enough. And Soto didn't want to come back a failure with no fortune to show, and so he pushed them on up into Mississippi, across the Mississippi River into Arkansas and Texas, and then back to the Mississippi River. And of course, he died of fever, famously buried in the Father of Waters. And the remnant of his force, about half the original body of men, made it by boats down the Mississippi back to Mexico. One of the big archaeological questions for centuries ever since has been, where was the Battle of Mobile? It's been the holy grail of Alabama archaeology. And there was recently a talk at the History Museum, some of you may have gone, where an archaeologist from West Alabama talked about the search for that site. She thinks they're now within half a mile to a mile of it. And the great scholarly debate over the years has been, how far south was Mobile? Some people say, oh, it was close to Mobile Bay, because the Spanish were coming down the rivers, and the Indians had all this vast civilization between the Alabama and the Tombigbee rivers. Others have said, no, it was closer up towards Selma or Montgomery. It seems like that's the more correct guess. It appears Mobile was somewhere in the vicinity of between Montgomery, Selma, and that portion of the state. They're just finding a lot of metal artifacts up there, and a lot of old Spanish horseshoes that the Indians then converted to other uses long after the Spaniards had gone. And of course, one of the most devastating legacies of that entrada was not just the battle deaths and wounds, but the European epidemics that spread for many years after that. So that by the time the Europeans got here in the 18th century, when the French came to the Gulf Coast, they found the Mobilians a much diminished tribe, maybe a couple of hundred warriors at the most. Soto was married to a woman named Isabel de Bobadilla, and this is a picture of her. And Isabel came to Cuba with him, but of course was not going to come to Florida, and so he made her the governor of Havana while she was waiting for him. And Havana at that point was located where it is now. So, and she's to date the only female governor, ruler, that the city of Havana, Cuba, has ever had. And was quite a capable administrator, knew how to look out for her interests and her husband's. One of the problems they had, as you'll see on the right, is that French and English corsairs were plundering Havana. It was vulnerable, it was relatively unprotected, and so one thing that Soto and his wife tried to do was to build a fortification to protect the harbor. And that fortification still stands today. It's called the Castle of the Royal Force, and here you see it. And interestingly enough, in the 1600s, a local sculptor did this weather vane that you'll see, and it's called La Giraldia, She Who Turns. And she's holding a Calatrava cross. She has her dress sexily hiked up on her thigh, because this is the West Indies and Havana, after all. And she's often, looking in the direction of Mobile on this tower on top of the Castillo that she helped build. And she's really become an affectionate symbol of the city ever since. And here you'll see she's on the Havana Club rum label to this day. You'll see her on city buses in downtown Havana. And she's quite a popular figure. And there's a lot of mythology about her. Most of it's what we would call folklore, but it's colorful nonetheless. Some people say that she actually stood in that tower and pined for Soto and cried tears for him and waited, and then when she got word of his death, she immediately died. It's a romantic story, but we know from prosaic documents that she actually returned to Spain, lived many years, and pursued several acrimonious lawsuits with her husband's former business partner. So she, I suspect, was made of sterner stuff than the romantics like to think. And interestingly enough, though she's such a popular and important figure even in modern Havana, there's a little bit of Isabella up here too, and she never came to Mobile or the northern Gulf Coast at all, but nonetheless, legends grew up around her. And here we see on Dauphin Island, the shell mounds, if you've ever been there, that wonderful park on the island, and then a map of the island from, I think, the Civil War period. There's an Isabel Point there on Dauphin Island that goes back at least to the Civil War, if not further, named for her. And then at the shell mounds, the rumor got started that she had actually sailed north with Soto's admiral, a guy named Maldonado, that when Soto didn't come back immediately and was sort of wandering around in the southeast, she ordered Maldonado to take her to the northern shore to look for him, and that they came and anchored in Mobile Bay, and that they camped on Dauphin Island, and she planted the island's fig trees while she was there. And that's how Dauphin Island got its fig trees. Then in the 1950s, this character was the curator of the Fort Morgan, on the other side of the bay. And Hatchett Chandler was a great raconteur, a storyteller to rival my grandmother, certainly in the realm of fiction. And Hatchett said that she had actually come across the bay and had wandered the beaches around Fort Morgan, and that she had cried bitter tears for her husband, and that his nickname was Leander. And so as she was crying, she would moan, "Oh, Leander, oh, Leander," and then planted the oleanders that we're now called oleanders. It's complete nonsense, but it's stuck as a legend, kind of like the Crichton leprechaun. You see how these things get going, and they never really go away, and so you'll still hear in the occasional coffee shop, you might hear about Soto or Isabel wandering among the dunes of Dauphin Island. So we've got a little bit of that. We come really more firmly into documented history, of course, with the French period. Pierre Le Moyne d'Iberville, who was our founder, French naval commander in the early 1700s, 1702. And what's interesting is that Iberville depended heavily on Havana. Havana was Spanish, of course. The French were on the Gulf Coast. And the Spanish didn't like the idea of the French being, you know, in the Mississippi Valley or on the coast, but their kings were at peace. So they had an uneasy detente. The Spanish would often refer to the French as the French thorn, but nonetheless, Pensacola, which was a Spanish burg, and Mobile cooperated a lot, sent supplies back and forth, and sometimes they'd besiege each other, but all was well that ended well. And Iberville, interestingly enough, actually died in Havana in 1706 during the yellow fever epidemic. He was there planning an expedition against the English in Charleston, because the whole reason the French were here was to hem the British in on the eastern seaboard. They wanted to dominate the Mississippi Valley, also have a perch on the Gulf, and have a robust fur trade. So what's interesting is in the 1930s, in recognition of a number of significant anniversaries, including the birth of LaSalle and Iberville and the Marquette and Joliet exhibit or voyage and so forth, a group of French diplomats, actresses, etc., came over on one of these fancy 1930s ocean liners named the Cuba into Havana Bay and had a series of events, and they wanted to visit sites that the French had been involved with in North America. But Havana was their first stop, and so they left this plaque that you see at bottom, which recognizes Iberville's importance. And then at the top you see an exact copy of that plaque, or twin of that plaque, that they next came to Mobile. That was their next stop. They came in, they docked at the state docks, and presented this to the city at the old Coffin Hotel, which I wish we still had there on the north side of Bienville Square. And so it's still there on this stone and in the square. So he's one of the other important figures that we share. And of course, more recently, we have this statue, which was originally cast in the 1920s in Montreal. And then to the right, you see a replica in Havana, Cuba, which was erected about 2000. And there were dignitaries from Mobile there as well as France. And then here you see the one that's right out front of Gulf Quest, who's facing his counterpart in Havana. And that was erected, I believe, in about 2002. Mike Dow was very instrumental in that. And so that's yet another way to recognize our connection. There was a lot of travel between the two cities, and some of you within your own families may have stories. I think Sandy Stimpson's parents celebrated their honeymoon in Havana. You know, pre-1959, it was so easy to go. It was so common for Americans to travel, and Mobile just was a natural trading partner and a natural base for tourism. And so here you see a little bit of that, the fruit ships, the bananas that went from Havana to Mobile in the Caribbean were a very important item of trade. And then you'll see here an ad for service to Havana from Munson Steamship. And it was interesting, the Munson Steamship line actually put ads in newspapers in Chicago and St. Louis, places that had, pretty terrific winters, and they would say, in 36 hours you can leave the snowy canyons of Chicago, Illinois, and you can ride a train to Mobile, Alabama, and you can get right off the siding onto this steamer, and then within, a period of 1 or 2 days, you'll find yourself, sipping a mojito on Havana Bay, and all for what's the price, $35. And you get, a white jacketed waiter that will bring you anything you want, a little electric fan in your room, and that's when travel was really nice. Of course, if you had a problem with seasickness, that could be an issue. One of a couple of other links that we share they're really interesting. One is baseball, and the other is medical science and the conquest of yellow fever. The young man at top left is a Cuban named Nemesio Guillot. And during the American Civil War, he came here in the 1850s with his brother and some other young Cubans, which is very common for Cuban students to be educated at Spring Hill College. It was Catholic. There's still a tradition. My sister-in-law is Puerto Rican. She went to Spring Hill College. There's still a strong linkage with the Hispanic world and Spring Hill. And so Guillot came here as basically a teenager. Really, Spring Hill then was almost more like a high school than a 4-year college as we would think of it. And then here we see to the right an early view of the campus. So while he was here, of course, the Civil War breaks out. There's a Union blockade, so the Cuban students can't get home. Things can't get to them. And while they're hanging out there, they actually learn this new game that everybody's playing. All the soldiers are playing it. The Yankee prisoners are playing it. It's called town ball or baseball. And they fall in love with it. Then in 1864, they actually get on a schooner to go back, break the blockade, get home to Cuba. As soon as they get off the boat, Nemesio has brought a ball and a bat with him and a glove. He gets out and starts teaching the kids around about this crazy new game. And they all go crazy for it, love it. And that's the genesis of the Havana Baseball Club, which comes out of Mobile, Alabama. We were down there back in March to dedicate a marker about that and the linkage between Spring Hill and Cuban baseball. And of course, it took off, and the Cubans are still some of the best players in the world. I think Mobile has 5 or 6 baseball Hall of Famers. Cuba has 5 or 6 baseball Hall of Famers. So that's a big deal down there. They're really interested in that connection. And then, of course, yellow fever was a scourge throughout the Caribbean and the Gulf, even into American cities up the Mississippi Valley, even places like Philadelphia and New York in the 19th century. They didn't know about the mosquito vector then. There was a Mobile physician who guessed at it, a guy named Josiah Knott, but he didn't put a lot of emphasis on it. He was really ridiculed for that idea, where his idea of the racial inferiority of blacks was taken seriously by the medical community at that time. So they got it exactly backwards. Nonetheless, Knott had the right idea, and then in Cuba there was a guy named Carlos Finley, physician, who began to do some experiments with patients and discovered that there was indeed a mosquito vector, that it wasn't miasmic vapors coming up at night that was, or refuse that was making people sick. It was just a tiny little insect. And so an Alabama doctor partnered with Finley and then, of course, the famous Walter Reed in eradicating yellow fever from Havana and making it a clean and safe city. And of course, the U.S. had great strategic interest in doing this. They had just fought the Spanish-American War and lost far more troops to yellow fever than combat. And they were trying to develop a canal across the Isthmus of Panama. The French had tried, everybody wanted to do it, and just the mortality rate was horrific. So they knew we've got to get on top of this scourge. And William Gorgas, of course, was born at Mount Vernon, just north of here. His father was a U.S. officer and went on to a very important career. And then more recently, just some of the figures that link us. Jay Higginbotham, who I talked about at bottom left, and here he is with a statue of, I think that's Soto in Spanish Plaza, which has recently been restored. Really nice complement to our long Spanish history. And then top left is a guy named Eusebio Leal, who was the city historian at Havana. Sadly, he died just a few years ago. But one of his real achievements was the restoration of old Havana. Many of the buildings were abandoned. There were a lot of people living in poverty. This was, of course, well into the Castro years. No such thing as capitalism in Cuba. And Leal really saw the beauty of this architecture. He'd loved it since he was a child. And he thought, well, this can be the way that we can make money. We can restore what we have, and people will come to see this. They got a lot of world help. UNESCO just declared it a World Heritage Site in 1982. And they just did some state-of-the-art restoration work in Old Havana. The Captain General's Palace, the Cuban Capitol, which dates from the turn of the century, and just phenomenal architecture that they have there. And Old Havana is by no means restored. There are thousands of buildings of which only a fraction have been beautifully redone. But they did not want to displace their residents. They wanted to keep it a living neighborhood, and it's really, really a remarkable place. And he was a great pioneer for historic preservation. And of course, Jay and Leal knew one another through the sister city relationship, corresponded. Jay would try to get Leal to come here. Jay would go there. There were political difficulties, of course, as there still are. And sometimes there would be protesters, particularly people would come up from South Florida in the Cuban exile community who didn't like the idea of an American city being a sister city with Havana, but Mobile was the first American city to achieve that. And sadly, both these men are gone, but I think they really built an important bond that many others are working to try to preserve. And so here we just see a few views of the two cities. Of course, Mobile you'll recognize. And the picture at the right is the entrance to Havana Harbor. That's Morro Castle right there, which a number of Mobilians have had the misfortune of being locked in irons in behind those walls going back to the 19th century. And this connection to the water is the center of it all, very critical. So that's a really quick and dirty overview of just some of the personalities and some of the events that link us. At this point, I'm happy to answer any questions.